So just quickly, my name's Robbie Stamp. I guess I was asked to do this because I hosted an event a few months ago, back at the beginning of the year. I run a thing called the AI Goosebumps Club, and it's based on doing thought experiments like, could an AI get goosebumps? And it's a way of exploring from first principles what AI is, isn't, and the nature of our relationship with it. I came to AI through a consultancy that my mother started, which has always been interested in the nature of judgment and decision-making in uncertain conditions, which is a major theme of Neil's book. My mother still works full-time in this subject, and just in case you're looking at me and thinking, well, how old are you, mate, and how long are you planning to keep your mum at work for? She was only 20 when I was born, and she's in her mid-80s now. But that her lifelong work has been thinking about the nature of how we make sense of our environment as individuals, as collectives, in the face of complexity and uncertainty, and that was really my journey to AI. So I'm your moderator for this evening, and then Madhu, if you would like to introduce yourself.
I'm Madhumita Murgia. My day job is that I lead coverage of artificial intelligence for the Financial Times. And my second job now, apparently, is I'm author of this book called Code Dependent, which for me started off as this creative side project during my maternity leave, but is now has now ballooned into this little thing that can go and people can read it, and it's been an amazing 4-month journey since it's been out, and it's reporting from around the world about how real people's lives, ordinary people's lives, have been changed through collisions and encounters with AI systems, and what that means for us as a society.
I'm Neil Lawrence. I'm a professor of machine learning at the University of Cambridge. And the atomic human is about, well, it's this idea that if every time the computer does something that we used to think of as uniquely human, it's a bit like Democritus's atom, where Democritus says, if I keep cutting into matter, and then I take one half and I cut again, and I cut again, do I eventually get to a point where I can't cut? And he called that the atom. Founded the atomists, and the question my book asks is the same. Is there a part of human intelligence that will never be taken by the machine? But I think what's really exciting is the way it covers. Madhu's done this amazing, her book's amazing, and she's done an amazing job of personalizing the experience, and I think, as was said, the books really complement each other very well.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that's fascinating about Maddy's book is that it takes the way in which AI is already so interwoven in so many different people's lives. What I want to start with is a question that I was asked when I went to a meeting in Paris for the British Standards Institute National Standing Committee on AI. Which is SC42. Are there any Hitchhiker fans in the room? Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans? Well, just for the fans, SC42, because people who know they're hitchhikers know that 42 is the answer to life, the universe, and everything, wasn't an accident. Rather beautifully, and Douglas would have loved this, there were two big new groups that were being set up, Smart Cities and AI, and there was a Brit in the room called Peter Brown who said, the next number off the taxi rank is number 42. So globally, the standards, SC42, is the global AI standards for the BSI, which is rather a nice little hitchhiker story. This great question, does the governance of AI feel different from the governance of traditional IT systems? And if it does, why does it? And I think that's that's the place I'd like to start. So, Madhu, I'm going to come to you first on that, because you thought about it in so many different contexts, so many different governance. Is there something different about the way AI embeds itself in complex adaptive systems from traditional IT systems?
So I think we're living through this moment of trying to figure this out. And whenever I talk to anyone who tells me they know the answer, I don't trust them. That's kind of my rule as a journalist. But I think, so this is what we're all trying to explore, right? We're discussing this technology as if it's something completely unique and unprecedented, and somehow it's going to recreate or augment, our own intelligence. And we now have people predicting timelines saying 10 years we're going to be there, 5 years, and so on. And every time we try and write this up, but it's not quite clear to me whether it is, and I'd love to hear from Neil, different to other waves of technological change that we've seen. But through my reporting, I guess what feels to me really kind of unique about this technology is how, even though it isn't in any way human at all, the way that it so closely mimics the outputs of human intelligence and communication changes how we respond to it. And that, I think, is more consequential than whether AI is different to human intelligence or different to other types of technology, right? So, for example, I spent a while reporting on loneliness and, whether we can use AI systems as a way to help solve that. And it sounds like, to me, it sounded like a ridiculous hypothesis to begin with, but I ended up speaking to lots of people who genuinely felt less lonely and more able to reach out to people in the real world because of of this relationship that they had with an AI system, which was merely a chatbot. So I guess maybe that's what makes it different and makes it also different to govern, which is not necessarily that it's inherently different, and I think that there's lots of arguments for that, but it's really how we are responding, reacting to it, and allowing it to sort of be embedded into the way we think, how we make relationships with one another, and eventually what that will mean for the future of us as a community. That scares me. I think that's something I think about more than any of the other questions in AI, like how will our relationship with AI change our relationships with one another, and that feels unique.
Neil.
I think, and that's something that I think scares me as well, that it's actually about human relationships and who we are. And there's too little of that in the conversation at the moment. So I think it's two sides to this. I'd say in some ways it's not different. And in fact, I think the real challenge we're facing is our failure to understand large-scale information systems already. So we haven't managed to regulate things that already exist. And we see that most vividly recently in the Horizon scandal. So the Horizon scandal is 1990s technology, right? And poor implementation of a system, but once the implementation is bad, after that, disempowerment of the accountants and the lawyers who should have understood something was going wrong. I mean, every aspect of the Horizon scandal, is one thing I sometimes say is we're sowing the seeds of 10,000 Horizon scandals right now, particularly when you're hearing people who have no experience of this technology, for example, heavily pushing, we should be urgently pushing this across the whole of the public sector centrally, rather than what we should be doing, which I think really comes clear in Madhu's book, is talking to the people who are actually trying to deploy these technologies in practice, the people who are experiencing the effect they have on human beings. And the problem that's happened with information technology is those two things have become separated. So decisions are being made at large scale by very few companies who sort of own the information technology infrastructure. And they're not purposely trying to be evil, but just they're utterly ignorant about people's real lives. And that, again, that's what Madhu's book does so well, is sort of talk about what those lives look like and the problems those people, and the positives and the negatives in a very balanced way. But the challenge we're facing in terms of regulation is it's very different. So in some sense, it's the fact that we haven't managed to regulate properly IT is why we're in this problem. But it's also different, but it's a shared thing with history of IT regulation, is that the very fact of the deployment and the invention of the technology is undermining our existing institutions. So you have a sort of set of, our society is made up by different groups, lawyers, accountants, civil administrators, doctors, all these sort of people who are supposed to be there to protect us. They're in institutions that govern their behavior, and their ability to make decisions about us is being fundamentally undermined by this technology at the same time as the technology is evolving. And I think that makes it quite different because those decisions are being made by such very, very few entities, and those entities are difficult to hold to account. So I don't think that, I think that I'm very against this idea that we have to throw away everything we knew in the past, but I think the speed of deployment means that we have to look at the way we regulate and try and understand how we increase the speed of that cycle. And also, one of my main focuses is working out how we can support and empower people with these tools. Because while it's creating a lot of problems, this new wave of AI could, if we deal with it correctly, prevent a set of solutions. Because it is a technology that for the first time, I don't know how many people are in the tech industry, but for the first time you may have been talking to a computer in a way that feels comfortable to you and getting answers out of the computer that aren't always correct, but are, you know, in a way that feels very natural to you. And that's the first time people who've been able to do that who aren't software engineers, who had to learn how to program.
I want to push a little bit. Can I just, in terms of audience, how many of you are regularly interacting at the moment with a large language model, a ChatGPT, or it's like? Okay, so that's what, about half the audience. Have any of you had an aha moment with it, where you thought, what am I encountering? What has just come back at me? Or has it all been the more populist, it hallucinates? Has anybody had a sort of moment where you, lovely, well, we might come back to that in a couple of the Q&A. That's interesting, and in fact, it's a question that's coming down the pike to both of you. I want to push just a little bit more on this question of what might be different. Madhu, it's thinking, I think, around this questions of when AI moves from being an advisor, fundamentally being an advisor. So coming to any one of you and saying, I've seen this pattern, I've seen this thing, what do you want to do with it? Human judgment and discretion making and discernment is yours. But there are issues around authority and particularly agency and autonomy, which actually make it different. And I'm going to ask specifically a question about tools in a second. But do you think there's something in the fact that this is a technology which seems to have forms of agency and autonomy which make it different? In some of the, and choose any of the number of examples that you've explored. And then Neil, I'm going to come to you because you did a very interesting historical tracking back, looking at what's governor and the engine, and what is there a boundary you feel we've crossed with this technology which has made it different. So I'd like to stay with this agency and autonomy question for a little longer and talk about some experiences there.
Yeah, I was actually going to say to Neil's point that the core of the point on, you know, can we govern AI is how can we, you know, it's not enough to say to people, this is a machine, it sometimes makes mistakes, it doesn't understand what you're asking, it's just a statistical system, because you can know all of that in your conscious mind and you can still go into it and think that you've seen that it made a joke, or that it was self-aware, or that it really did get what you were saying, or it was empathizing with you and it really helped you to feel better. You can know on one hand that it's, you know, not human in any way, doesn't reason, understand, feel, but still have the responses. And so much of it is how do we design systems, and this is what my book looks at in practice. How do we design systems that maintain human dignity and agency in areas that are really consequential? So an example of it going wrong is I looked in Amsterdam at a system that the mayor's office had put out, and this is essentially a predictive algorithm that was predicting which young children would go on to become serious criminals within the next 5 years. And they produced these 2 lists that were sent out essentially to families across Amsterdam saying, your child is on this list. Congratulations.
Had a rather Orwellian name, did it?
It was just called the top 600. So the top 600 was, both lists ended up being mostly boys, mostly immigrants from North Africa, from those like North African immigrant and Senegalese communities in Amsterdam, even though it was race blind, gender blind, everything blind. And all these parents knew is that their children were on the list. The 600 list was boys who had committed crimes previously, not always serious crimes, but had been in trouble. But the second list, the 400 list, was mostly brothers of the first list who had in many cases never committed any crimes. So they had been witnesses or victims of crime, domestic violence. They had been connected in some way in their community to children who had committed crimes, or there was other things like truancy from school and so on. Yet they found themselves on this list. And I thought that was, the lists in themselves feel obviously very, minority reports, so obvious it doesn't even bear saying. But that wasn't to me the most disturbing thing. It was how in practice what it did to those families, where having this scarlet letter put on the backs of many of these boys meant that they lost confidence in themselves. It broke families apart. It made many of these families were single parent, single mother families who started to question their own ability to parent. There were threats to take the children away from them, and just a gold standard example of how not to include somebody when you're using an AI system to make a major social decision. It was supposed to help them. It was supposed to bring in social services to help to prevent these children from going down this route, to support these families. But really, in practice, they fell apart. And so I think, how we preserve a single mother's, how we empower her to be involved in this decision. How do we empower the boys to take responsibility for what they're doing and to actively want to participate in their own future? Those, I think, were the key questions. Instead, what happened is they just found themselves on a list that police knew their names, would call out their names in the street, and they felt that they were trapped. And so, I think it's we have the answers of how to regulate these systems. It's, where do we need to respect human expertise? Where do we bring in police, doctors, teachers, and so on? And where can we respect the judgment of a system?
And it's that space where AI is wielding authority, either delegated or implicit. What I'm also interested in, Neil, is one of strikes me one of the big themes in your book is an exploration of the history of decision making as a sort of what it means to take a decision in any number of contexts, and in this particular context of thinking about forms of agency and autonomy. And one of the things we worry about is AI agency. It's taking decisions itself without a human in the loop. And you did I think a very interesting sort of way with any number of examples, but from what's governor to the complexity of the decision that Roosevelt was making, Eisenhower was making before D-Day. So your sense of agency and autonomy in these systems.
Yeah, I mean, it was Diana was the mother, right?
Yeah.
And is it Damien was the son?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a really important story because I think relating to that. So what they've done in that, I didn't read all the details of the background of the story, so Madhu may correct me, but presumably what they've done is they've looked at database of children that are in trouble, and they've tried to find features that predict this. And I think one of the heartbreaking pieces of that story in particular was the fact that the more the mother engaged with the social services to try and get support she had this difficult son. I think he was going to go to prison. She managed to persuade the court that she should look after him at home.
Yeah,
so
he
she
was only 14, I think,
he was
at the time.
So because she didn't want him to go to prison and learn all these things. But then, of course, she'd engaged an enormous amount with the authorities, and this all counted as black marks against her family in general. And this is the difference, I think, between a performative, I'm not great on the social science stuff, but performative and normative stuff. So this is a sort of like, what I think of this from a machine learning perspective. So what someone's doing is they've got this database. It's not well connected. I mean, you mentioned it was academics who were engaged. I mean, who these academics were, God alone knows. But maybe the way in which things can go wrong is maybe they did an academic study that said, well, here's some indicators we find. And then it makes a big difference about what you do with that academic study, and then actually you send letters to people. Because you could imagine you could use that information to resource care or something like that. Maybe you could use that information to say, let me resource this area because we know we're going to get more queries here. It's different to go back to the families because that's a performative effect. That's going back into society and pushing back. Now, and then I think it comes back to this, coming back to the question about agency. I think the more you think about human agency and what it means is in some sense it's a healthy illusion we all have about each other. It's somehow an agreement that we're all part of society and we're subject to the same jeopardies in that society. So if I make a decision about someone else, they can be hurt in the same way I can be hurt. So on this basis, look, full stop, machines can never participate. And that's one of the points in my book. They can never participate, right? We choose to sometimes cede our agency to machines, or process, or companies today. Companies already represent an entity which has its sort of moral component of its decision-making removed. It's a way of scaling decision-making in such ways. I mean, any of you who've been a boss in a company who've had to make a difficult decision about an employee, can you make that decision about a friend or a family? The reason you make that difficult decision to send some poor single mother home because they're fired because of whatever else, right? Companies have processes that remove our moral obligations to other people. So they are already existing ways in society of scaling up. And the reason we have that, the reason we accept that, is because our moral obligations are tremendously difficult. And they weigh on us very heavily when we're interacting with other people. And we're not very good at scaling them. So actually what goes wrong when we move beyond our own group, we just ignore the moral implications and we just say, oh, those are just a bunch of people in another country. It doesn't matter if they're dying, right? So it's actually that we have to introduce process to scale what we're doing. What you see with AI is just process at a greater scale. And I think the thing that's really worrying about it, and I try and communicate in my book, but Madhu's or also communicating it with the specific stories, is the way that decisions about where we want that process to exist and where we don't want that process to exist are being imposed upon us. They're not things that we're participating in. In fact, regular people aren't even being empowered with the understanding of what's going on. Regular people are being told, you can't understand this, we're going to do this centrally, you could never understand what we're doing, you just have to listen. And that's deeply problematic. But I think it's an extension of something that's been happening. I mean, my last chapter, I talk a lot about Baroness Honora O'Neill's 2003 Reith Lectures, A Question of Trust, which is already about how people are not being allowed to make their judgment decisions. They're being held to account by processes around them. Look at teachers being scored by how they mark how many pass exams, which is a different thing from educating our children. And there's a problem in society that we've already gone down that route. And if we go down that route that it's all process and it's all measurable, then we can be replaced with AI. But if we go back to a position where a lot of these things are judgment and there are professional people that we train in society and we support in making those decisions, then I think we institutionally gain some of that agency back, and I think hopefully we will gain some of that agency back.
And I think it's one of the things that we explore when we do the Goosebumps Club stuff is 3 categories of words that you can use to describe what AI is, how it's manifest in the world, and critically manifest in relationship. Words which you go, so a word like authority, for example. Can an AI wield authority over you? You probably don't break its meaning by saying yes, it can. A word like empathy. Can it show empathy? Can it be empathetic? Maybe not to discuss. But that critical point around accountability and the things that it cannot be because it cannot suffer. It can't feel pain. And therefore, almost every single normative structure that any society has ever created has the capacity to punish a bad actor meaningfully through various pain mechanisms, whether that was society's pain of death, physical punishment, but shame, guilt, remorse, all the things we're capable of feeling with, which sit at the heart of our systems, which is why this agency question interests me so much, because they're things which start to act in our world and sometimes start to act autonomously, but are absolutely outside of any ethical normative structure framework we've ever created.
I would just say that, it's easy to say these are autonomous systems and they act autonomously and it's us against the machine. But in practice, what I found is it's us ceding our agency and autonomy to systems that are not in any way perfect. They're far from perfect. It's because of, we have this automation bias, and it's not just with AI, it's whether it's with cameras or autopilot in planes, where we sort of assume that this is a deterministic machine, which AI is not. It's something that's actually just a probability machine, but we assume that it has an answer that's right or wrong, and therefore it must be correct. So if you have an AI system that says, yes, that's a facial recognition match, that feels a lot more definitive than you in your head thinking, that does look like that person, but I'm not totally sure, because we can't put a number on how sure we are. But you can have a facial recognition system that says 72%, and what does that mean? And so often in so many examples that I found with police and facial recognition, with doctors, with social workers, you sort of doubt yourself because you have the machine there that seems to be sure of itself and put a number on something. And so we allow it into these spaces in this very slow and insidious way until we get to a point where the new people being trained in these systems just can't exercise that judgment or don't anymore, and the machine knows better than us. And so it's much, I think it's not about it being autonomous, it's about how we treat these machines.
Can I therefore segue on that point to one of my favorite pages in your book? I think it's page 26, where you talk about top trumps and you describe the singularity as hooey. Which I think is really interesting, because I think there is a whole field out there. I mean, we're probably more in agreement than there could be other people on this panel who see the runaway AI, that's the, we're how far in, we've done very well, we're 30 minutes and we haven't mentioned the Terminator. But that, that moment of runaway, it will be smarter than any human being. It will be smarter than any human beings. And so much of your book is about the nature of embodiment and decision-making and the recursive loops. But that wonderful page where you've somehow managed both to call the singularity hooey and describe top trumps, can you just talk about the singularity briefly? Because this does go to a debate that is being had about the moment where it does escape our clutches and we have ceded too much. That's a lot of the Silicon Valley bro discourse around it.
Yeah, and I find it quite worrying. So the point Robbie's talking about is like, if you think about our intelligence, and all these arguments are based on, and then we'll have an intelligent machine that creates a more intelligent machine, and eventually they'll sort of run away and super intelligence, and it's going to want to do all sorts of things. There's so many complicated things going on not in the argument, in the heads of people who say this stuff. Which are mistaken in various ways. The first of all is that intelligence is not like height. It's not rankable, right? You can, it's not even like, Madhu's shorter than me. She probably has a lot better time on planes than me. So it's not even clear that taller is better, right? So even with height isn't like height, but there was this sort of notion that, that actually is a eugenic notion, and there's no other way of saying it. It comes from Galton in the 1860s, that the idea that we can breed people to make them more intelligent, and Britain goes into a real, I don't talk much about this in the book because I want to sort of open with these other analogies, so I use a sort of top trumps. And the core idea of this is, you want to talk about artificial general intelligence and some rankable nature of what it is to be human. Well, you just tell me, what's the artificial general vehicle? What's the ultimate vehicle? What's the ultimate thing? So, the vehicle that can defeat all others. I mean, and the type of people we're dealing with, they're people who see themselves as Ferraris, and they think it's the Ferrari. Well, I tell you, it's the transit van. Because, we could survive all without Ferraris. They're very impressive and impressive to look at, and society can support a few Ferraris. But we need transit vans to move stuff around and to do functional things. But even then, what about aeroplanes? What about bicycles? What about everything else? You can't rank vehicles. And the game of top trumps kind of shows that. The game of top trumps, you sort of like, we might be playing, Madhu might have the Ferrari F40, and she'll say, and then I have the transit van, and I'll say carrying capacity 2 tons, and she'll say carrying capacity not even a set of golf clubs, and I win her card, right? And it's what's going on with that is the people who say these things are so unself-aware and so obsessed with their own abilities, which are impressive, that when they see a machine that can outperform them in some narrow sense, they think, oh my God, we're all doomed because this thing can do some stuff better than me. It's like, well, have it try and play football. And even then, what we care about in football is the heartbreak and the people and the stories. If you watched the final last night, the run-in's all about Gareth Southgate, and you're like missing out on a final. The stories are about people and their stories. You can never have a machine replace that. So there's something like right at the heart of our intelligence. And cool, yes, we can have super mathematical people and everything else. And it's nice to have this diversity of things. But there are fundamental aspects to our intelligence where you can't tell which is the right way if you don't know the context. If we know I've got to do a building job, then we know the transit van is the right vehicle. If we know I've got to get down to Brighton, then we know the train is the right vehicle. When I tell you the challenge, we can tell what the vehicle is. And what they're doing is this weird conflation of, yes, sometimes we measure intelligence. So sometimes we do maths tests or whatever else, and then we understand some aspect of that. They're combining that with this sort of notion of something that is much more complicated than that and can't be ranked in that way. You know, the reason why if it were the case that there was one way of being intelligent that was the way of being successful, evolution's pretty good. It finds stuff. It would have found it. The reason it hasn't found it is because there is no one way of being intelligent.
I think, Madhu, sorry, you wanted to respond.
I think it's really fascinating because everybody I speak to, so, you know, as a journalist, I speak a lot to people in the tech world, at people building these systems, and there's such a singular way of thinking about intelligence to the point where nobody even bothers to define that. So it's kind of like, you know, intelligence. And I was talking to someone, you know, the other day, one of the people building one of these language models who said, all knowledge, you know, all of human knowledge exists on the internet. And I found that ridiculous statement, and he was just looking, and I said, that's obviously not true, right? And he said, of course it is. It's everything we need to build an intelligent system exists on the internet. And I was like, I don't even know where to start with that. Like, what about emotional intelligence? What about oral storytelling? What about, I don't know, like visual and all of these others? But that's the thing, when you have a single objective function that you're trying to maximize and you need that type of rational intelligence to get there, that's kind of how everybody who builds it sees it. And I've talked to women who've worked at DeepMind. There was a story that I've been working on for a while, which I haven't done yet, but who often talk about who's in the room when there are discussions about, you know, what is the big artificial general intelligence and what are we trying to build, and, you know, how everybody just sees it as being rational, you know, type of intelligence to calculate things rather than thinking about other ways to arrive at solutions to a problem. And I think that's actually really fascinating part of why a lot of the issues that crop up with it in practice, why it fails.
And just to add, sorry, Robbie, just to come, and what's made it worse is that the core community who came up with these ideas, they were a diverse community who understand different natures of intelligence. But the community is now dominated by people who've joined very recently and kind of are obsessed with some of these ideas. Very smart people. So we've lost, like, because like the major conference in this area, when I was going to it in 2001, there's like 400 to 500 people. There's now 16,000. And I tell you, the quality and diversity of ideas has massively reduced because something's working. So they're all doubling down on it. And this is feeding this problem. And it gets to the point where their notions of cognitive diversity are, oh, I knew a person at university who did philosophy, and I asked him, normally him.
I think there's a very profound, I mean, I was asked to leave a group, literally asked to leave a group because I called the singularity a deeply colonialized white male fantasy. And I stand by that. I think it is. I think that the
What
fundamental...
group was it?
Sorry?
What group was it?
It was a group discussing the economic singularity, so the risk of technological unemployment. And Madhu, to your point about whose knowledge counts and who doesn't and what constitutes knowledge. So, you know, an Aboriginal woman walking the songlines in Australia, having learned a way of navigating the outback in a deeply embodied way, does that not count as knowledge? Digitize that. So if you can't digitize it, therefore it doesn't count as intelligence. So you go, well, hang on a second. This omniscience claim that you're making, do you really mean omniscience? How, for example, does the machine know what each and every one of you will go away now having experienced right now in our brains, in our bodies, as you can sit and feel the press of your body on the chair, feel your heart rate, feel the slightly muggy air. Each one of you right now, each one of us is reaching back in time and space through any number of experiences, conversations. Some things are landing, some things aren't. But it's a completely unique experience in the history of space-time, and it will stay that way as well. And it's not digitizable and knowable. We were talking about, you've come across how much, so much of how religious so much of the language, in fact, around these hyper claims is. And your last chapter in your book, in fact, rather interestingly goes there.
Yeah, exactly. It's quite unexpected for people who get to that final bit. Takes a turn. I end up in the Vatican with the Pope. But it was really interesting because there was the chief rabbi of Israel was there, and I was talking to one of these rabbis, and he actually said, this is a lesson we've learned over time, the folly of power or of thinking that, thinking in a certain way and believing your way is the only way. We know, we've seen how that's created bloodshed and how that's failed. And I think, he was actually saying tech companies should learn from that. That there isn't, you can't have a monoculture, and you have to look at other perspectives as you try and design something that's going to impact everybody. And I just thought it was really interesting to see how widely this technology has moved out in practice, out of the computer science labs in Silicon Valley, the people who care about it, that it's touching. Yet, as Neil said, the decisions, really the power is still held by a very small number of corporations that all think and act in a very specific way that affects all the rest of us.
Neil, what do you see about sort of the religious language and some of these huge omniscience claims that are made about this?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And in fact, the approach I take in the book is, so going back, I read Superintelligence, and I really struggled to get through it. And Nick Bostrom. I did struggle to get through it. This is about 2015. And one of my students gave me, because he's a Greek student, he knew I like Greek myth, and he gave me like a book about Greek myth that I read sort of around the same time. And I was really struck by the similarities between, and I was at this Asilomar meeting with Elon Musk, and this is like 2019, and I mean, and basically what was going on is within Silicon Valley, I mean, Nick's a very nice guy, and but he's become a sort of high priest of this superintelligence religion for a lot of people who are so anti-religion that they don't realize themselves when they're falling into the negative aspects of religion. I mean, it's fascinating, really, because I'm not religious. I don't believe in God, but I'm like aware enough to look at religions and sort of say, oh, well, they do some interesting things. And one of the really interesting things they do is they moved away from this sort of Greek myth. I mean, if you look at like the character of Zeus, the character of Zeus is like a Silicon Valley tech bro's wet dream. I mean, it's basic, and that's what's going on in sort of ancient Greek religion. I mean, he's constantly dodging his wife, trying to sleep with beautiful women and all this sort of thing. I mean, and it's sort of like you see that so strongly, and it's these caricatures of people in society dominated by men. I mean, it's fascinating, actually. But then, if you look at, I spent a lot of time with a group of, I didn't get to do the Vatican and the Pope, but I did a lot of stuff in St. George's House with different religious leaders from across the spectrum, Judaism, Orthodox, Reform, Muslim. And what fascinates me about them is, first of all, their ability to ground ethical ideas in ways that make sense to people, because they're very practiced at it, and most academic ethicists aren't. But also the way that they use this notion of another intelligence, of God, for introspection rather than narcissism. So what you see it in the Greek thing, it's a sort of, I think it's using this notion of another intelligence, of a powerful God, narcissistically. And then I think that what modern religions do when they're interesting, they use it introspectively. They say, well, if that's an all-powerful thing, what does it mean for me that's a vulnerable, frail thing? And so in some sense, I mean, that really drove the theme of what I tried to do in the book. It tries to do the same thing. It tells a lot of stories, and it tries to push people away from that narcissistic thing towards introspection. Because I do think these are two sides of the same coin, or they're on a spectrum, right? That you can push us, an unhealthy absorbing with our own selves is narcissism, but actually reflecting on our behavior and standing back from it and thinking, how can we do better, is introspection. And when I was made to go to church, they would try and make us do that every week. I wasn't that up for it when I was 14, but now, maybe I do it a bit more, but not in church.
There are so many threads so many threads we could follow. One of the things that I was going to, Maddie, with the work that you do, have you felt sometimes that some of this discourse, which we'll move off, kind of throws sand in the face of the kind of looking at the very immediate harms, risks that are being faced right now? Yeah. I mean, it's a little unfair to do this, but there was one of the people who really does have a claim to be one of the godfathers of this modern version of AI, asked why he wasn't supportive of Timothy Gebru and so on when they wrote that paper. And he kind of went, yeah, but they were talking about this stuff. I was doing the big existential risk. That's boys stuff. That's the big manly stuff, not this stuff. Have you felt that sort of in any pushback or your book or in your work, that kind of that question around whether some of the bigger existential risk stuff kind of gets in the way of needing to focus on some of the things that are happening right here and now?
Yeah, there's been this big, dichotomy in the debate about should we care about, harms now versus harms in the future. And I think that I agree when people say we don't have to pick. Like, I might not today believe there's an existential threat from AI, but there's, scientists are always thinking about hypothetical futures and testing theories. And so why not? Why not have a small percentage of people that think about what would happen in 20 years' time if X, Y, Z were to happen? How would we plan for that? What would that look like? Fine. But we can also think about reality today. And I don't think it's only tech companies that have to do that. They definitely, I think they don't. Because they have to be so entrepreneurial, and there is this evangelical nature of we're not even going to question why this is a good thing. Like I've had very few satisfactory answers for so why do we want this thing? Like what are the good things we're going to get out of it, right? And of course there are some great answers around healthcare or science, but a lot of the sort of economic things are, well, it will just make us more productive, quicker, it will write emails for us that it will also read, and then we won't have to either read or write emails. I'm like, that sounds pointless. Or somebody who says, oh, there'll be a digital twin that will take meetings for me with other digital twins, and it's like, okay, but then what's the point of us? But nobody seems to question. And then one person from one of these companies, a senior leader, told me, oh, it can write bedtime stories for your children and tell them the bedtime stories. Wouldn't that be amazing? And I'm like, oh my goodness. Yes, it can get boring to doing it day in and day out sometimes, but I'm not sure that I would want to abdicate that completely to an AI. And so I think there aren't a lot of satisfactory answers about why this is a good thing, and that it feels quite sort of it's a similar thing of just not wanting to question why we're even doing the things that we're doing.
I want to be careful not to make it all sort of too dystopian. So, Neil, some of the opportunities that you see as well. I mean, the spaces where it really genuinely is going to augment who we are and what we are.
Yeah, I think, Madhu's making some great points in that space. And I think for me, we live in a very difficult society, a very problematic society. There's already a lot of inequality. And a lot of that inequality arises through lack of access to information or understanding or work. And it's one of the things that Madhu does a great job of in the book is showing the balanced world of single mothers who are on sort of from Syria. She was a bit working in Bulgaria, supporting a family through gig work, which is labeling. So there's some really interesting aspects to what it could give us, which actually just return us something closer to the state we were in terms of work, sort of 400 years ago, people working more at home and being more in control of what they were doing. And I find, there's all these technological things we could talk about, like improving cancer diagnosis. The problem is it's a human amplifier. And humans are both amazing and pretty crummy simultaneously. And so it can amplify the crumminess and it can amplify the amazingness. And I kind of disagree a bit with the we can do both thing. Because I don't even know if this is a good analogy, but while I was cycling over here, I was thinking about the problem we have with that group of people. and companies who are pushing this argument about existential risk and these weird futures that they're talking about. My best argument is it's like they're a sort of 50s American dad who spends their days working, doing their important job at home and comes home and says, where's my dinner and why haven't you brought the kids up? And it's just this world that is based on everything's about economic output. An amazing colleague of mine, Ruth Lawler, who's now at Cornell but was at Cambridge with me, once sort of said to me, he said, the problem we face is that every way we have of measuring economic value in our economy was developed by a bunch of guys in the 18th century where the only value of work they put on was male work. And when you see this panning out, so it's no surprise that the economists threw you out, because for them, I mean, not for all economists, a lot of very interesting economists are saying there's problems with that, there's problems with this. But that sort of whole notion around our society based around GDP and income and is very in line with what the sort of AI people think. And if you see some of their definitions of AGI, it's like, oh, it'll be an economically rational agent. It's like, well, that's deeply problematic as well, because we know all the problems with economy too. But the problem with the focus on existential risk is, it took our whole... There are really two really great interventions for dealing with the existential risk that they talk about that we can just apply today. Because when they talk about existential risk, it's a combination of two things: power asymmetry and automated decision-making coming together. That's what they're telling you, that you've got an entity that has an enormous amount of power and it's doing decisions automatically. Well, guess what? We have laws about power asymmetry, competition, for example, competition laws, competition markets authority, consumer laws. We have laws about automated decision-making, GDPR being a law. Now, there are gaps in those laws. There's gaps about what it might mean to put an economic agent on the web buying things for me or something like that, which we need to think about. There's lots and lots of gaps. But we have laws already to deal with this. The problem with the people that talk about this stuff is they'd never bothered to study it or look at it or even read any of this stuff. So then they just want to go in the newspapers and tell everyone that everything's broken and they're the only one who understands how to fix it. But when you ask them, so what should we do? They don't actually have any practical solutions over and above the existing approach. That's exactly what happened in the UK. We spent 18 months running around screaming and saying safety summit, and at the end of it, the setup is exactly the same as it was before. And I know that because I was involved in setting that up. But on the positive, sorry, Robbie, coming back to your question, it becomes about how we're convened. And it's not about whether some person in Silicon Valley thinks this or thinks that or can invent this or invent that. In the end, we've got so many stories from our culture about the person who thought they could invent a magical thing and it all went wrong. It's like every time, the way you can deal most of the time in these things, if you just sit in a meeting and you think, this feels like the first chapter of an Isaac Asimov novel, then just assume it's going to go wrong, because that's always a narrative artifact to set up some dystopian consequence. So when people are calling for worldwide bans on AI, think, well, that's an opening chapter from Isaac Asimov, so this clearly doesn't work. What does work is looking at mechanisms from the past that we have used to convene people in ways that brings the best out of us. Because we are this combination of very animalian instincts, very selfish instincts, and much higher thinking. And we're at our best when our culture elevates us and brings us above ourselves and makes us do better things. But we're at our worst when we're told this is about you and this is about what you're going to do next week and so on and so forth. And so to me, the big thing we need to understand is, well, how do we bring that best out of us? And we're doing that in a changing landscape.
Madhu, has there been anything that's particularly shocked or surprised you or about the response to your book? Sort of, what is there as you've had responses, or a fabulous question which made you on one of these panels go, had to really sort of sit back and think? Is there something you can summon in the response to the book that has really caught you and felt, oh, I'm glad that seems to have landed?
Yeah, it's funny because I say at the beginning of my book that I'm a techno-optimist, which you might not have gathered from our discussion today, but also quite agnostic about the sort of impacts. And I went into my book as a reporter who was agnostic to the outcomes. I was wanting to find out, what does it look like in practice? How does it shape lives, both for better and worse? But since it's come out, the reviews in particular, but also what I hear from people is that it feels very dystopian, and people are, shocked by the ways in which it goes wrong. And I guess I should have known that, but it's funny because I didn't finish the book feeling pessimistic or fearful or, this is so awful. It felt like, to me, just a way of uncovering, like Neil says, the very human ways in which we are co-evolving alongside it. And yes, a lot of these stories, so we've talked about Diana, but there's stories of, AI predicting teenage pregnancies in northern Argentina, where I went and spent time in the barrios there to understand how that affected the families there. And it seems like these are dark stories, but, people are still living their lives, even the people who know they've been failed. Like, I spent time with two women who were deep faked into these awful pornographic videos, but they too have, found something good from that, and, are now activists, are now speaking out about why we should have rules and regulations. So I guess for me, what I want people to think about beyond the darkness, some of the darkness in the book, is actually the human spirit at the end of it, and how people often also said, it's such a fast-moving thing. How could you write a book that will still be relevant in even a few months' time when this thing changes so much? But for me, it's about real people. Their lives continue, and the lessons we learn from them we can all apply to ourselves moving forward. And so, yeah, I think so it's not that I wasn't shocked by that, but I think I would hope that while yes, maybe it seems dark on the surface, I want people to go away thinking, so what can we do about it? How do we do what the people in this book did and fight back and find a voice? Like the Uber Eats worker who created Uber Cheats, which was a way to actually figure out what he should be paid compared to what Uber was paying him, and kind of shared that with other Uber workers. So how can we find our voice as a collective when things feel like our agency is being taken away? And I think that's I love those questions around, like, how can I do something about this? What can I take away?
I think I'm going to come to questions in just a second, but just to sort of pick up, Neil, on something you were saying, I think one of the things about when we think about intelligence and think about our embodiment, that it encourages to not see this intelligence as a sort of scala naturae, and there's mycelium network intelligence, there's octopus intelligence, there's all sorts of other forms of intelligence. And indeed, the great Douglas Adams, who I knew quite well, is on record as saying that the whole import of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was that every species in the galaxy thought that they were more central to the story than they are. And I think that point you were making, there's the famous Immanuel Kant quote about out of the crooked timber of humanity, no true thing was ever made. And I think one of the things AI is encouraging us to do is to look and see where are we at our most constructive? Where are we at our most destructive? And I think maybe one of the great moral, political, philosophical challenges of our day is how we both celebrate humans at our most constructive and get over ourselves at the same time. And AI encourages us to do that and have that thought, as well as all the exploration of other forms of intelligence that people are studying and looking at the moment. So that kind of, I've been thinking about this notion of radical humility, a radical humility that comes from being forced to think about these questions, which in a way sits at the heart of your book as you think about the nature of the atomic human, which is those bits, the pain of unrequited love. I'm not going to go there too hard. It's happened twice. It's awful. Could an AI ever be an unrequited love? Of course, well, no. And therefore, and that's central to who we are. So with that embodiment thought, I'm going to start to questions. Again, please keep them as questions. There are some mics around the room. I understand sometimes a question needs a teeny bit of context, but really, please keep it teeny. And I was at an event at the Hay Festival where this instruction was given out, and somebody still managed to take 5 minutes of airtime not asking a question. So as we've only got 15 minutes for this, I'd be really grateful if you can keep them really rather short and sweet, and we can therefore fit as many in as possible. So looking around there's a lady in the front row. How many mics have we got? Just the one. Okay, lady in the front row, and I clocked.
Hello, thank you so much. This has been so refreshing. Hello. Thank you so much. This has been so refreshing. I've worked at 2 AI startups and focused on online harms. And the main thing that people sort of share with me is just their terror, no matter whether you're talking about the existential risk side or, you know, how this affects humans. And I think you both made excellent points around how the general public and wider groups should be involved in sort of how technology is implemented. I suppose, what recommendations would you have for how to engage people who are outside of the sector, as in not sort of as involved in deploying tech, in a way that can help them be sort of part of the discussion and solution without feeling so terrified?
Fabulous question. Yep.
Lots of stuff in AI and education. There's a really impressive group convened by Sir Anthony Selden around this. And a lot of that is peer-to-peer groups. And we're also seeing this, we're trying to work with councils and local decision-making authorities. People are fascinated. And if you're in any organization where people are fascinated, bring them together. Have like a play group, PLAI, look at that, what I did there. Where people can just come together, talk about what they're trying with the technology, share their stories, and in an open environment, share what things work, what things don't. And I think that's a really, really good approach to get people going. Encourage them to play, but in a sort of safe space with colleagues who can be supportive.
Madhu?
I think whenever anybody is implementing it anywhere, is the way when you get people involved. So at work, for example, at the FT, when we're starting to have conversation, we now have access to ChatGPT and Gemini tools, and everybody's curious now, and like Neil said, interested. And so we've started convening. We've done focus groups, listening sessions. Like, what are ways that it's helpful to you? What are the ways that you hate it? And people want to talk about it at that moment because they're starting to use it. And I think that should be the case when a local council starts using it, or your HR starts using it for recruitment. So it's at that moment of implementation where you can get you can canvass opinions. Schools, like there are schools already that are starting to think about rolling out AI with kids. Like, no, get me involved as a parent first and let me have a say of like where I want to draw the lines. And I think the more of those that you have, it feels like a conversation for everyone and not like a tech thing, which it isn't, right? It's in education, it's in HR, it's in hospitals.
There are three quite good questions I think about with this stuff. This first question is, how's that working for us? So when it's being, how's that working for us? Second, who do you mean by us? Who got to define us in that context? And critically, of whom are you asking those first two questions, which encourages that much wider citizens' assembly kind of approach to those things. How's it working for us? Who do you mean by us? Because a lot of times in these economic systems that Neil was referring to, where the incentive structures, a lot of people, sometimes powerful men, would go, it's great. How's it working for us? Great. I always turn left on the airplane. I've got a couple of houses. I've got 3, and I've got a very good wine cellar. Thank you very much for asking. But if you thought more carefully about who is us and who got to define us, and of whom you ask those questions, it's a very simple, quite powerful governance rubric. Gentlemen there in the blue shirt.
Yes, hi there. First of all, thank you very much. It's very insightful. My question is around, like we talked about human agency and how we are tempting, so we tend to devolve agency to AI. What are your thoughts on this in the context of warfare, considering that sort of technologies usually evolve and come from a warfare background, and what are your thoughts around, or I guess your worries potentially around AI and warfare and human agency in this respect?
Madhu, do you want to take that one first, and then we'll come to Neil?
Sure. There was a great investigation by 972 magazine. I don't know if people have seen that. It's an Israeli magazine showing how the Israeli army was already using forms of advanced deep learning to make target lists, and that were being pretty much automatically acted on in terms of weaponry being targeted at these people and spaces, even though they were supposed to have a human in the loop. And there was this amazing series of interviews with senior generals and others saying, yeah, we're supposed to approve it, but in practice we were just sort of rubber stamping it. And so it's already happening, it's already here. Probably a lot more sort of widely used than we think today. It's not in the future, which is kind of the theme of everything I talk about. We're already doing it. And I think, if it turns into a race, then that is where I see this becoming an existential issue. Like I can't see how it could be a good thing to kind of loop humans out of this, as is already happening. So yeah, hugely concerned.
Yeah, and I think the worry is that because people aren't understanding that interaction between the human and the machine, even if people think they're building something which maintains the human's power, you see the same challenge that we all have with GPS now. No one knows how to go anywhere or do anything anymore because they're too used to GPS and they don't understand how to navigate anymore. And mostly that's fine, but actually there's a lot of evidence that our brains, the prefrontal cortex, fires in sympathy with the hippocampus, which is involved in navigation. And in effect, with ChatGPT, we built GPS for navigating problems. So not just in terms of the judgment of commanders, but also in doctors. It's another piece that was coming through in the story of Ashit in Madhu's book. There's the potential to really undermine our agency and for us to sleepwalk into a place where the machine is making decisions, and be very careful, not even good decisions, just decisions based on what people did before, not decisions based on our evolved circumstances and how the world's changed, which is how a human would make the decision.
I'm just going to do one quick thing before we come on to the next question. Of everybody. So, quick thought experiment. If you encountered a piece of art, and we'll make it a piece of art, it's a painting. You don't know its provenance, and it moves you. You look at it, whatever it is, you look at it the first time you see it up there on the wall, you feel you have a relationship with it, and it speaks to you. If you were to discover that it had been created by an AI, would it spoil the experience for you? So think about it. So for those who think it would spoil that experience and that encounter, put your hands up. Just look around. Look around. It's really interesting how many of you think somehow, because that artist, I don't want to beat this theme today, hadn't been ever in unrequited love, hadn't dandled its feet in the sand one beautiful morning. It's a very interesting thing about embodiment.
Who wouldn't spoil
there's anybody who doesn't feel. Okay. In lieu of a question, I've got two questions lined up. Gentlemen there, why wouldn't it change your point of view? Very brief. Oh, no, actually, so I'm mucking around on the microphone thing. I'm mucking around the microphone and being bodied. Do you want to just, it's very kind of you, sir, to see the microphone. We will come back to you. The gentleman's just here. And fairly brief.
Hi, thanks. I think because our experience of the artwork is kind of formalist, so we're looking at it from its form. And when we think we understand the intention and the kind of the artistic motivation for it, that's an illusion. That's such an interesting thing about the nature of the beholder's share in that moment of relationship. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for ceding the mic briefly. We'll come back to you now.
Hello, hi, thank you. I've been working in AI since the 1990s bubble, so I probably have a different view to some of the panelists. If science fiction, good science fiction, turns a mirror on society, do you think AI is turning a mirror on society today, and it's society we don't like, that prioritizes economic value above product of individuals, or marginalizes underrepresented groups, not AI?
That's a very subtle question. Madhu.
So, sorry, is your question AI is just reflecting society and that's what we have a problem with, rather than with
Yes.
AI itself?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never really, I think we're all aware. We know, we understand what inequality looks like. We know that judges aren't fair. Sometimes the decisions they make after lunch differ dramatically to the decision they make before lunch. But that, I think Neil said this, it's something we recognize. It's a human recognition of knowing the sort of framework of what human bias looks like. It's about how someone looks that's different to you. I think for me, AI feels different because it's not only magnifying those societies' ills that you talk about, but it's creating new biases that aren't rationally comprehensive to us as humans. So for example, it might be discriminating against someone not because they're a woman or disabled or brown or whatever, but because they happen to, I don't know, own dogs or be renters. I don't know. And it's purely statistical. There's no purpose or motivation, but that's still occurring, and it can multiply and occur at scale. And I find that, seeding large scale kind of decisions to that much more disturbing than doing so to a human. But that might be because I'm not a computer scientist.
So I should quickly plug Shannon Valor's book, which is called AI as a Mirror.
Which is really good as well.
And yeah, she's great. And I haven't read that book yet because I haven't been on a panel with her yet. But I'm sure that will happen. But I'm not sure I understand the basis of the question. It's like AI is showing that we're crap, so that's okay. I mean, because in some sense, number one, that's not okay. The whole point, and that's what religious groups are very good at, trying to sort of improve ourselves. We should be trying to be better. And then the number two is the nice thing about human crapness is it happens at a small scale, and it happens between us individually, and we have all sorts of evolved societal mechanisms to try and rein it in that we've learned over 100,000 years or more of evolved culture. And the problem with this crap is it doesn't have any of that, and it's just being redeployed on us without those regularizing forces.
Right, we're going to take one more question, as brief as we can. Our answers as brief as we can, because then I've got one more question for each of you, which I'd like to finish up with. And I apologise for people I haven't been able to get to.
Hello, I was just wondering, so my question was, do you think that the asymmetry in understanding of AI between the asymmetry in the understanding that tech firms have and the understanding that people in society have, do you think that that could be used by tech companies and large firms for potential malicious purposes to increase their output or to maybe manipulate the public in certain ways?
Thank you.
Do you think that could cause problems?
Thank you. Madhu.
I think that the power asymmetry includes knowledge, and that's, for me, really key to how the relationship between the creators of AI and the rest of us will evolve. I think it's really interesting because increasingly with generative systems, people are speaking to it as if it's some kind of not necessarily human, but an intelligence that understands what you're saying, right? And I've even spoken to very successful investors who tell me that they use it as a way to kind of play with it as investment thesis advisor. Should I do this? Shouldn't I? Help me decide. So, it's very personal. It's again, there's people who use it as therapists, relationship mentors, even actual relationship partners, right? There's Xiaoice is a Chinese girlfriend generator, AI generator, and it's generated 500 million AI girlfriends. So it's so personal and intimate, the things that we're willing to tell these systems. And I don't think we've quite caught up to the thing that we have with, say, a Google or a Facebook, where we're saying this is all ultimately data that will be owned by 3 or 4 companies. What can they do with it? How can they sell us things? As you say, if it knows exactly how you think and your vulnerabilities, it's so much easier to target at scale and to persuade you to do things. I think that's definitely the next step of how we should be thinking about regulate.
Neil, forgive me, because of time, I would like just to have got, if there was one book, film, podcast, piece of music, anything that has mattered hugely in your life, that has made you think and reflect about AI deeply, what would a recommendation for people to go away and read, think of, something that, whether it's Winnie the Pooh thinking about Huxing, something which would slightly left field, that would make people think, not another AI book, but something which makes you think about the nature of being human, and therefore our relationship with AI.
I'm usually really terrible at these questions, but I do have one. It's not, for me, it's Ted Chiang's short stories. Exhalations is his most recent. He's only done 2 sets of them that, very short. And the previous one was called Stories of You, and it got turned into the film Arrival, which was about aliens coming down to Earth and humans trying to decode their language. But every one of his stories are like little gems, and they're not about AI necessarily. They're about being human and what it means to be intelligent and the role of language in our lives, and they're so amazing.
That's Ted,
So I
Ted,
recommend.
Ted Chiang, Chiang. Brilliant. You've had time to think.
I guess one story that I find very interesting in this regard is a very old story, which is the story from the fall from the Garden of Eden. Because it's actually, for me, a story about agency. Like, in that story, and I think different cultures view it in different ways, the idea is you've thrown out of paradise for understanding knowledge, and oh, boo-hoo, us. Well, for me, that story is about something very different. By gaining free will, or the illusion of free will, whatever it is, we create our own problems, and we need to find our own solutions. And the thing we're being told is this weird notion of, by the tech utopians, is that, you can get the AI to be the new God and return to the Garden of Eden. I think that would be an awful state, and I think actually we would die out very quickly within that state. So I think viewing that, and that really comes from like spending time with faith leaders, particularly Jewish rabbis, use a lot of revisiting the Hebrew of the original stories, trying to think about these classic stories and what they mean or what they're trying to say to us. So I don't know. I feel that it's totally dystopian to go back in the Garden of Eden, but I also accept that other people feel differently, and we need a way of a negotiated solution.
Fabulous, thank you. And I think, Rosie, thank you. I think that's a wrap. Thank you all very much indeed.